Folks, you may be seated. I hear the crinkling of candy. And just to give you a sense of the candy timing, so very end of the service, I'll give you a signal. You let the cantor and the rabbi step aside to get out of the candy path, and then, just a few minutes, I know they're good candies. If you want to have a nosh, that's fine also. Where's Eddie Mishner? I saw Eddie. There's Eddie. Yeah, so Eddie and I kibitz about this with some frequency, but those of you who know me even moderately know that I am what would today be called math challenged. Math challenged, right, Eddie? Yeah? Yeah. So I remember I was always this way. I mean, from the time I was little, and I remember once we got into more complicated math, which to me was really about third or fourth grade. I think we started doing, long division comes in right about, that was it, I was done at that point. Fractions made me absolutely crazy. I still don't really understand fractions to this day. Algebra completely intimidated me, made very little sense to me. Forget about trigonometry. I really wondered when I was taking trigonometry if I was going to graduate from high school. Because in New York State, I grew up in New York State, and you had to finish these core classes and take a Regents exam. Those of you from New York know what I'm talking about. And in the end, in terms of my trigonometry final, I am convinced to this day that it was with help from God Almighty, or at least my trig teacher who had Rahmanas on me. And I did graduate, but I have not, very happily, have not studied math since I was in 10th grade. Thank God for calculators, which of course we all have on our phones these days. But the problem is, what is a mathless rabbi supposed to do with this week's Torah portion that we call in Hebrew Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness, but in English we call the Torah portion Numbers. The book is Numbers, and the Torah portion Numbers. The text begins with a census. I don't know if you were following along on the English side. Begins with a census. The portion itself is filled with numbers in every chapter. Just a few examples I'll share with you that I've chosen randomly. There's 59,300. That's the number of males aged 20 or over from the tribe of Shimon. There's 603,550. That's the total number of males eligible for military service. There's 22,273, which is the number of recorded firstborn males in the Torah portion. There's even a math problem in the Torah portion at one point. I know Ben also doesn't like math, but at one point it actually says, the text says, you have to multiply the number 273 by the number 5. If you do that, you'll arrive at an answer of 1,365. That is in the Torah. Now, of course, numbers here serve a purpose. Here in the Torah portion, the numbers serve a purpose. The Israelites needed to know what their number was. They needed to know how many of them were eligible for military service. That was very important. How many of them would be responsible for conducting worship at the tabernacle or for carrying the objects of the tabernacle when they move from one camp to the next camp. But over time, Judaism became very wary of counting people, eventually arriving at a place where Judaism today prefers not to assign numbers to people, not to count people at all. That's why in Exodus, the book of Exodus, one of the counting techniques is for each person to submit a half shekel, and then you count the half shekels and not the people. It's a way of avoiding counting human beings. Or if you've ever been in a traditional shul, and they're right around the number they need for a minyan, they need to know, do they have 10 or do they not have 10? Again, listen carefully. They don't say 1, 2, 3, 4. They actually use the motzi, the words of the motzi, to count people. And if you ever have realized it, there are exactly 10 words in the motzi. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. 10. And that's how they count people in a traditional shul. Now, there are a variety of explanations as to why Jews don't count Jews. One idea is that counting makes people distinct, which it does. In other words, you're 2 and I'm 3, right? There's a difference there. So we don't want Jews to be separate. We want Jews to be communal, to be united, to feel connected. But I've always suspected that the tradition was uncomfortable with counting people for a different reason, which is this. Once a person becomes a number, then they're not an individual anymore. Then they're just a number. They're not a name, they're not a face, they're not part of a family, they don't have a story anymore. It's just number 632 or whatever the number might be. They're a statistic. And then once a statistic, they can be analyzed mathematically manipulated and thought about in abstract terms once a person is a number. There's something about that is dehumanizing, that takes away individuality and takes away also self-worth. Some of you in the room may remember the 1981 Police album, Ghost in the Machine. It was a big hit back in the early 80s. Yeah, I saw the Police on that tour. Did you see them on that tour? They were great. There's a song on that record, Invisible Sun is the name of the song, and one of the lines, I don't ever want to play the part of a statistic in a government chart, right? That kind of captures that idea. And to me, it's a problem of our internet-driven age, the computer-driven age. We have more ways to turn people into numbers than we ever have before. And I'm sure you know when you're using your iPhone or you're on your computer and you're in a web browser that every click is tracked, and then there are algorithms that go to work to make you into a statistic, to define you by a series of numbers. That's done to communities as well as it's done to individuals. It's done even to entire areas of the country today with what's called big data. Big data, you've probably heard the term. It's mostly a collection of information about Google searches done in a particular area. That's how they arrive at big data statistics. Now, there's some accuracy in the numbers. I'm sure there's something important that can be learned from them. But we also know that numbers can never tell the full story. Numbers can never tell the full story. So I said to Jay and Fred, are they still Jay and Fred? I said you remember the date I said, Jay? I said I'm going to say something about May 8th, 1970. You know what that date is, Steve? May 8th, 1970. So those of us who are NBA fans know that the Knicks, I'm from New York, I'm a Knicks fan, Steve's a Knicks fan. I don't think Rennie's here. Is Rennie here? Rennie's not here today, Knicks fan. So a few Knicks fans in Baltimore. The Knicks are in the Eastern Conference Finals for the first time in 25 years. That's a long time to wander in the wilderness, right there, okay? And as a long-time suffering Knicks fan, it's a big deal that they're in the Eastern Conference Finals, even though they have a very difficult game tonight in Indiana. We'll see what happens with that. But one of the most famous moments in NBA history came in a Knicks game, May 8th, 1970, Game 7 of the NBA Finals. Willis Reed, exactly. Game 7 of the NBA Finals. The Knicks captain, Willis Reed, had torn his thigh muscle in the 5th game of the series. They're playing against the Lakers with Wilt Chamberlain. So the 5th game of the series, Willis Reed tears his thigh, can't play, doesn't play in Game 6. The Knicks get killed in Game 6. Game 7's back at home in Madison Square Garden, but there's no way Reed is going to play. But the famous moment is he limps out onto the court. You know, he can barely walk. He limps out. Madison Square Garden explodes. People are cheering left and right, and he plays a little bit in the game. Anyone happen to know his stat line in that game? Anyone know? So he plays 25 minutes, that's it, a little less than that. He scores 4 points, that's it, and he pulls down 3 rebounds. That's it, nothing. Nothing. The numbers were completely unimpressive, but there was something intangible that happened the moment that he stepped out onto the court, something you can't measure with numbers. You know, you call it the X factor, whatever you want to call it, right? And whatever that thing was, that's why the Knicks won the championship that night. Not because of the 4 points that he scored, because of the X factor, the presence, the feeling, the emotion that he brought into Madison Square Garden that night. And one of the problems with our culture today is that we commonly forget about the X factor, and we commonly measure people, and sometimes ourselves, by numbers. That's how we evaluate people. You know, what's a person's salary? That's a number, right? What zip code does someone live in? How many years did they live? How many children did they have? At the end of the day, those are all numbers, and we tend to believe that when the numbers are good, then the story is good as well. But I'll tell you something. In my seat, I've known plenty of people, and you have too, if you stop to think about it. They had long lives, they had a lot of children, they were paid high salaries, and at the end of the day, they were pretty miserable people, you know? And the reason for that is that all of the things that are most important in life, you cannot define by numbers. You cannot define them by numbers. You can't put a number on the quality of a person's relationships. It's impossible. You can't put a number on a person's emotional intelligence or on their ability to cope with trauma and tragedy when they have to do that in their lives. You can't put a number on the way someone expresses their joy or the way someone laughs or the way they bring humor into a conversation or into the world. And I would argue that all of those things, much more so than the numbers, give us a true sense about who a person is and what the quality of their life has been. So truth be told, I'm not a huge fan of this morning's Torah portion. Nothing against Liam, who's done so beautifully. It's just my numbers thing. I still wrestle with that. You know, the Torah does have this penchant for counting people and adding them up as if they were something to kind of be packaged, put into a database. Instead, I much prefer the approach of the prophet Hosea that Liam just chanted for this morning's Haftarah. And in the very first verse of that Haftarah text, V'haya mispar b'nei Yisrael kechol hayam, asher lo yamud v'lo yisaper, right? That cannot be counted. Behold, the number of the people of Israel shall be like kechol hayam, like the sands of the sea, which can never be measured, can never be counted. Instead, they will simply be called the children of God, the children of God. And that, at least it seems to me, tells more about the Jewish people than any number ever could. And that's my kind of math. Shabbat shalom.